Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Today we're going to be going over mass communication theory. Now, theory means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For some, it's applicable to life, and for other people, it's kind of a boring chapter you have to read in some sort of textbook that your professor or teacher might assign to you. Theory is theoretical, isn't it? It doesn't really apply to everyday life. Well, in fact, that's not really true. A theory is a system of principles that, governed together, try to explain a particular process in life. Why people watch television, why plants grow. Theories help us organize information. And so the reason why you're watching this video is because you are eager, I hope, to learn a little bit more about how scientists, be it political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, mass communication scholars like myself, how we explain what goes on in the world. So let's get to the first slide. So what is communication? I think we kind of have to hammer out what it means to be a communicator before we can kind of divulge what a theory is and what some mass communication theories are. So for one thing, communication is any kind of expression, any kind of idea that is expressed. And so for many people, it could be a painting that might have words from the New York Times painted across the canvas. Or it could very well be a news article. Or it could be Michael Kay. I listen to Michael Kay. He's a radio journalist on the Yes Network, for all of you Yankee fans out there. That's also a form of communication as well. And so when we think about communication, it really permeates every dimension of our lives. When we talk to each other on the phone, when we text, even interpretive dancing is a form of communication. And so when you start really thinking about it, communication really is ingrained in our everyday lives. And so when we think about theory, it's a way in which to explain why something occurs. Differently, a law, like a law of gravity, might say, well, everything that is on planet Earth will stay grounded unless otherwise changed by atmospheric pressure. And so a law will tell you that something happens, but it won't tell you why something happens. This is where theory comes into play. And it really helps us understand why things happen in the world the way that they do. Let's go to the next slide. So communication model, what we have here is process, symbolic, meaning, and present. And so communication is a process. It's a process by which we discern information out to people. It is symbolic in nature because communication relies on signs, meanings, different kinds of logos. And so next time you're in a grocery store, think about the packaging that's in front of you when you're looking at your favorite Oreo cookie package. Is it blue? Is it red? Is it green? These colors convey certain kinds of meaning. We know green is usually meant for environmental. We know that blue is more relaxed. We know that the color purple can invoke royalty. And so there's a lot of symbolism in our everyday lives that we're actually bombarded with, especially if you think about the amount of advertisements that we come across, another form of communication. The third paradigm here is meaning. There is some sort of meaning that is conveyed from the process and symbol attached to it. If we're watching an Oreo commercial, that's the process itself, the way in which the message is being disseminated. There is symbolism there because there is the Oreo logo itself, but the commercial itself might also have children from the 1990s dunking Oreos, And so that might invoke or summon some sort of nostalgia for consumers. And so that might pull on their heartstrings and also pull on their wallets for that matter, thus making them more inclined to purchase a bag of Oreos. And then present. A lot of communication happens immediately, right? This is a process that happens like that. And so in a mere matter of seconds, something is communicated, an idea is communicated. Even if you're reading a long novel, if you read a sentence or two, communication has been disseminated instantly. So communication is a model by which ideas and expressions are governed, and it's a way in which for them to be disseminated out to audiences. Let's go to the next slide. So we can't really talk about communication without really going back to when communication was an area of study. And so communication harkens back to ancient Greece, primarily, in which philosophers debated what really constituted reality, truth, and knowledge. And so communication really began as an art in appreciating rhetoric and debate. Grecians really relied on communication. It was very typical for people in town to have debates, to have speeches, to articulate ideas and expression. It was really something that ancient Greece held dear. And so Corax of Syracuse was actually the first person to really start a business in educating people on how to debate, how to come up with an argument, how to speak, how to address the public. And so this business actually helped a lot of people when they were arguing legal cases in court. Let's go to the next slide. Sophists came out of this. They were kind of born out of this tradition. So rhetoric is this notion that reality, truth, and knowledge are all socially constructed, and they are reliant on language. And so everything that we take for granted is based on whatever society we're born into. And language can be very powerful. Is something dark or is something bleak? Is something joyful or is something happy? Even words that are similar in meaning, the sophists would argue, you have to carefully pick out particular words that you'd like to use when you're trying to perform some sort of debate or construct some sort of argument. And so mastering language was something that they really took upon themselves as something that was critical and really kind of a duty for a lot of citizens. However, they were also criticized for deception by this practice. And, a lot of it was being claimed that they spun a lot of arguments. They kind of twisted a lot of logic. And this was something that was practiced by the sophists as some sort of criticism toward them. But they did make innovations in the art of persuasion. I do think today you can still see the sophists' impact on society, particularly if you look at public relations. And I'm not saying public relations or advertising, for that matter, are deceptive, but certainly both industries have been criticized for being deceptive. But advertising and public relations both rely on the art of persuasion. And sophists were instrumental in building and erecting the study of persuasion and how to convince others of a belief or an argument or an opinion. Let's move along. Plato came out of this. Plato was a student of Socrates. He did reject the sophists, though. The sophists had been around when he was studying under Socrates, but he had rejected it. He opposed Greek democracy. He believed that democracy undermined truth and justice. And he really did see rhetoric as an art, not really a science. He believed reality was comprised of timeless forms. And so he had this notion that ideas were kind of floating conceptually around the world. And so we ascribe meaning. We ascribe these timeless forms into forms. And so love might be captured in a painting, but love is a timeless form. So is beauty. And so Plato kind of argued that there were a lot of conceptualizations out there that really didn't take a body or objective or tangible form for that matter. Let's move along. Aristotle, a student of Plato. You might be seeing a pattern here for a lot of the philosophers that kind of came down the line in ancient Greece. Many of them studied under the preceding scholar or academic superstar. And so when Plato was an academic superstar, Aristotle studied under him. And so he kind of bridged the gap between the sophists' attention to practical questions and Plato's conceptual quest for truth and knowledge. And so Aristotle was instrumental and very interested in studying empiricism. I myself am an empiricist by trade. The kind of communication research that I do is objective. We actually look at data. And so empiricism really tips its hat off to Aristotle as somebody who really got the ball rolling on careful observation of the physical world, making notes, and seeing how a theory or how data might vary over time. He starts this idea of systematic observation. Source credibility also comes here to play as well. The audience's perception of a speaker's competence, character, and goodwill are important. And you might notice that this dovetails nicely into being a really good empiricist. If you have good data, if you have solid knowledge, if you have conducted careful observation about some phenomenon in the world, then you can erect and execute a really, really good speech and really be able to persuade people about some sort of argument that you might have. Let's move along. So with modern communication theory, we looked at the ancient Grecians, and we looked at some of the philosophers. So you're kind of getting a taste now of what that did for modern communication theory. Now, modern communication theory is only about 100 years old as of the time of this recording. And so certainly there had been study of other theories in sociology and studies of other theories in psychology. And so mass communication certainly pulls from psychology and sociology. Sociology really becomes big during the Industrial Revolution, in which a lot of scholars are studying people moving to the city and saying to themselves, well, if people are moving along to the city, what is that going to do for society? What does that mean when a lot of people are moving into the city? How does this impact society? A lot of people were afraid that crime would go up, and it did in big cities. A lot of people were afraid that people's morals would be tested, and people might even jettison or abandon their morals. Some people did. And so this really starts this quest to understand how people in big cities function, and how people in big cities function with billboards and advertisements and other things that at the turn of the 20th century are really coming out. In major cities, advertising starts taking hold. Especially after World War I, it really starts up. And so people are being exposed to big billboards for Macy's. They're being exposed to newspapers, massive national newspapers. And so this idea of people now being exposed to media at a high dosage was troubling for some scholars. So in the 19th century, the humanist tradition and the social scientific tradition are both born. English and rhetoric departments at universities are starting to become concerned with media effects. Newspapers are coming out, and we are having more and more newspaper readers. Again, news is slow around the country, and so, we have printing press, certainly. We certainly have people reading mini novels and newspapers and things like that, but we don't have radio yet. Radio really doesn't take off until just after World War I. Scientific tradition is also being implemented here, and it's really interested in understanding interactions between people. We're starting to develop sophisticated methods of measuring human interaction, something that we really didn't think about doing beforehand. But born out of really anthropology in studying tribes and cultures and other people, we start studying ourselves here in the United States. And so by the 1920s, with the rise of mass media, more national newspapers, radio is booming at this point. Communication researchers begin publishing reports about what they're finding with consumers. And so they're doing interviews, they're talking to people, they're trying to get a sense of what's going on. The survey method has not yet become mainstream in mass communication research. It's a few decades away. That goes the same for focus groups as well. And remember, nobody has an app here. There's no Netflix app or New York Times app. So these companies and researchers cannot readily obtain real data that does not exist. And so they're doing the best that they can with the research methods that are available to them. Let's go to the next slide. Criticism of mass media in the 1940s. We have this idea of what the hypodermic needle theory is and how it might be applicable to consumers out there. So it's this notion that people are literally injected with an idea. Now, there were no actual injections for those of you who might be squeamish, but a lot of scholars were worried that a propaganda video or a propaganda newspaper was literally injecting people with information. And so a lot of scholars began studying mass media, kind of with a chip on their shoulder, saying that it was doing deleterious things to people, that it was undermining the fabric of society. And so scholars were particularly interested in Hollywood. By the 40s, we have the early movie industry, the golden age of Hollywood. And so between Hollywood creating movies, between Hollywood creating propaganda, and Nazi propaganda also being out there as well, scholars were very much interested in trying to understand, what did this do to people? Did it really impact people? The answer is yes and no. A lot of people were not really persuaded either way with propaganda, but a lot of people were as well. So because this answer was kind of in a gray area for a lot of scholars, it really propelled them to keep studying and to keep refining theories and variables and the way that they operationalized these variables for their own methods. And we'll get into variables and operationalizing definitions as we move along. A lot of this study is rooted in behaviorism in the 1930s. Media message, as I said, is injected into a passive and willing audience. That is the hypodermic needle theory, or otherwise known as magic bullet. The idea is that the audience is passive and willing, and they're just taking a shot, literally, when they watch TV, when they watch movies, when they listen to radio. But as I said, largely found to be unsupported, some evidence, but really wasn't enough to further or advance the theory. Scholars felt that we could do better theoretically in trying to explain how media impacted consumers. Let's go to the next slide. Paul Lazarsfeld and NBC. Believe it or not, Paul Lazarsfeld was part of the reason why I myself was interested in pursuing a PhD. It was really cool to find out that a PhD actually worked with companies and actually did some really, really cool stuff. And so he worked alongside NBC for a number of years through the Columbia University's Bureau of Applied Social Research. And so he did some work for NBC in understanding their audiences, but he was really part of a cognitive revolution in the 1950s toward mass acceptance of the scientific method to systematically test theory. This is related to Aristotle, who we were just talking about. The idea that if you do a test of, for instance, uses and gratifications, this approach states that people use media because they have some sort of expectation from using media. If you apply it to TV, and then you apply it to radio, and then you apply it to film, those are three studies that may support the existence or application of uses and gratifications theory. Now you have some sort of body of knowledge that you can access about audience consumption habits. That's what makes this so interesting, is that theory really serves as a way to organize all of these studies that come out, and it helps scholars understand what's known and what isn't known. And because of this, and because of the work Paul Lazarsfeld did, a lot of scholars have adopted this notion of looking at what other studies have proven and then seeing what else can be tested, what else can be explored. He was absolutely instrumental in two-step flow theory and opinion leader theory. Two-step flow theory is this notion that an opinion leader might have some sort of communication and then may forward it to other people. And that's kind of part of the two-step flow theory. So an opinion leader may be PewDiePie today or Markiplier today if you watch YouTube channels and if you watch people playing video games. Those gentlemen are absolutely opinion leaders. Samantha Bee on TBS, also an opinion leader, for sure. And so she may receive some sort of message and then give it out to people who follow her. And so those are two steps. And so we can quickly see how how these theories might explain why people elect to use the same body scrub as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. In fact, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has, I believe, about 1 million followers on Instagram, if I'm not mistaken. And in a recent Variety article, it was stated that if Dove, Express, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, any kind of company wanted access to his followers, the baseline for what they'd have to pay is $1 million. So you can quickly see how important it is to understand theory. It can absolutely be applied here. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is definitely an opinion leader, no question about it. And it would explain why some of his followers might use the same body lotion that he uses or drink the same drinks that he does. When a celebrity is put on a platform and they're able to communicate ideas to followers, then you start to have a two-step flow theory, but opinion leader theory can also be applied here. It's this notion that people will follow a leader's opinion and they may be swayed by that. And so the next time you watch a commercial with a celebrity in it, bear in mind that one of the reasons why you might be open and kind of a willing and passive audience member is because you might have some sort of expectation or perception of the celebrity. And if it's positive, then you're more likely to be receptive to the message that he or she may be disseminating out. Let's go to the next slide. Media criticism in the 1970s and 1990s. And so in the 20th century, there's a lot of back and forth between media scholars. Media is good, media is bad. Media can undermine society, media can enhance society. Let's not forget, things like Sesame Street were boons to society because they helped all children improve their critical thinking, reading, and mathematics levels. It has been demonstrated that media can have super positive outcomes on society. The question is, what are people consuming and how are they consuming it? As well as what agenda media might be setting. And so this was a theory that became very, very popular back in the 1970s and is still widely applied today, and by far and away is the most, or one of the most studied areas of mass communication, agenda setting theory. So it's this idea that the news media, be it radio, be it newspaper, could be magazine, could be television, may frame a story or subject with an underlying agenda. So they may frame a story in a particular way. As of this lecture, Donald Trump is in North Korea talking to its leader about nuclear disarmament. And so some media channels like Fox News, for instance, may frame the story differently than CNN. And I'm not saying either is good here, but it's important to understand certain media channels have their own agendas about what they'd like to present to the public. And so it may impact voter agenda, which may match media agenda as well. So audiences may evaluate the importance of a story based around how much is covered. And in fact, some stories get more coverage than others. So there really are two levels of agenda setting theory. Technically, there's three, but two have really been hashed out through previous studies, so I'll go through those. The first level of agenda setting is what to think about. This was a monumental finding back in the 1970s. A few studies had come out demonstrating that the way in which media frame stories and pick stories really impacted what voters thought about. It really told us what to think about, which might be horrific to some of you. It was certainly horrific to the scholars when they found that there were correlations here. A second level agenda setting theory states that media also can tell us how to think about something. It's not just that you should be thinking about the economy, it's also how you should be thinking about the economy. And so the next time you are watching Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or any of these news outlets, think to yourself, am I watching this and having my perception swayed? Am I thinking about news stories differently? Is the way in which I interpret something different because Fox News wants me to look at something differently? Or CNN wants me to think about this but they want me to think about it in a particular way. Two levels there for agenda setting. And so media has been found to be able to have quite an impact on people from a massive, massive standpoint. Mass communication as a discipline is called mass communication because traditionally a lot of the communication outlets we have disseminate messages to a mass audience. That's where that comes from. It's the idea that you're disseminating information to millions and millions and hundreds of thousands of people. But we know that with the advent of the internet and with the advent of social media and with the advent of online advertising, it's really no longer the case. People disseminate information to mass audiences, but increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller audiences. And so mass communication as a study, as a discipline, is evolving. And it has to take into consideration that a lot of people are receiving messages now in fragmented forms, in fragmented groups. People are no longer watching Friends or Seinfeld, these shows in which garnered 20 million viewers per episode. Those days are kind of over. And so mass communication study has had to evolve along with these cultural trends, really studying how audiences fragment and how fragmented groups may consume and interpret media. And so that's all we have today for Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.